Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and today we're going to be doing a complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Vortex Proton. The Vortex line is one that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the mod community because they don't mod particularly well, but I am absolutely fascinated by the mechanical workings of them, and I would like to see how they work. So, we're going to start with the simple one, and then I will do the more complicated ones later on. Now, let's take a look at the controls. The Proton is a rear prime, rear breech loading blaster, which in and of itself is nifty. You pull back on the priming handle and it primes and opens up the breech. You put a vortex disc in there and you can simply force it forward and it will close. Or on either side there is a small lever. They did make it ambidextrous. I do appreciate that. And that will close the breech. You can then pull the trigger and it will fire out the disc. Now, another feature that exists on the back here is this little button, which is a jam release. If you push it forward, it will simply eject the round out the barrel. Now, you cannot pull the trigger while it is not loaded. It does have a trigger lock. You can open the breech after it's been primed, if you wish, without firing, so you can always just reopen the breech. It won't necessarily bring the disc out with it, but it usually does. And so that is pretty much all there is to it. Let's get this thing open and see how it works. Right, so far all of the shell screws have been the same length. There was one missing, which either means there was one missing from the factory, or that I'm not the first person to try to open this blaster. It's entirely possible that I used this one for a previous episode of Captain.xavier.reviews. Who knows? There are two screws in the front that you have to take off in order to take off the barrel shroud muzzle thing. They are all the same size so far though. See if there are any more screws. Doesn't look like it. We should be able to get the shell open now, hopefully. You definitely want to make sure the blaster is not primed when you open it. Okay. Now there's something we haven't seen in many blasters. There's a lot more on the far side, on the side with the screws, than on the other side. And there's a lot of stuff on both sides. But we'll take a look at this side first. There's just a little bit of cosmetic bit there. There is our top rail. I assume that is part of what is holding the disc in place. That when the slide comes forward, that pushes down and puts tension on the disc. That little levery bit there puts tension on the disc and keeps it from falling out of the barrel, and then when you use that de-jamming button, it pushes it far enough forward that it can then slide out. That's my theory. The rest of this appears to just be the rail. That's held in with a pin and a torsion spring, so I'm not going to fiddle with it. This does come apart if you needed to, but again, it's not necessary. The only thing up here is the rail nubbin, so I'm going to leave all of that together. And let's take a look at what else we've got. We've got our slide release bit, and that is held in place by a couple of washer head screws and a spring. I don't feel the need to take that out. There is an odd bit of extra plate here. I assume it's necessary, but there's no way to have it molded in, so they had to add that on. Seems to be part of the rail that the slide slides on. Yep. Okay. That can come out. We then have whatever this is. And we got a plate here that looks like it's got the same shell screws. Can we get this out? Okay, got that out. A couple of small silver screws. Yep. Okay, so we've got this wheel here that is under spring tension, another pin with a torsion spring that makes it want to go back. But we have this little spring-loaded angled surface that forces it forward. So we'll go into that when we go to reassemble. Oh, and it does have a spring that is non-captive, so be aware of potential springage. Okay, and that's everything from the far side other than that release mechanism, which I'm just going to leave on there. Now we get to the dirt and grit filled other side, which is much more complicated. And I'm not even sure how to get most of this out of here, so I'm going to start taking out screws. We got a pair of black screws here. Still cannot remove our trigger assembly. Here is where our main spring is. These do not use a compression spring like the vast majority of Nerf blasters do. Mostly you're compressing a coiled spring that you compress it down, and then when you release it, it releases a plunger that then goes forward. This doesn't operate that way. This uses a torsion spring, a spring that wants to spin, as it were. And that fires a catapult arm. So that is our, instead of a plunger tube with a plunger head and all of that, this is a catapult that hooks on the inside of the disc and flings it forward. And that is why these things don't get modified much, because finding an upgrade spring for that is complicated. And this one is just full of gunk. But it really doesn't matter because it's not going to affect anything. We do have a pad, a rubber pad here with a spring in it. There is a screw that is holding our spring in place, so we are going to remove that. Is that different than those? No, I don't think it... yeah, it is a little bit, so we're going to keep that separate. Okay, now things are going to get angry and springy, I suspect. Yep. That thing is under tension. Held on with a pin. Take the pin out, which will allow you to then move the plunger arm. Got a couple of screws under there. Okay, now we can get our catapult arm off. It goes on there like that. We can get our main spring out, which is this wacky looking thing, and that right there is precisely why these are hard to upgrade. You would have to find a replacement, more powerful version of that very specific, funky looking thing. Now, one thing people will do, and it looks like it's actually specifically even designed to allow for it, is this was hooked on that first screw post and then had a washer over the top of it. But if you were to move that to the further one back, and there's even a groove in the plastic in the shape of the head, if you were to move it back to there and put that screw over that second hole, it would increase the power of this blaster. So this one actually looks like it was almost intended to be upgraded, or it may have been previously downgraded. I'm not sure which. That is fascinating. It might have also been something that somebody opened it up and did it wrong when they reassembled it, but there are two potential screw posts there that would allow you to adjust the power slightly. So be aware of that. This can then just probably come off of here unless it's been glued on. Alright, let's see if we can get the rest out now. It doesn't look like we quite can yet. It looks like we need to take the rest of the trigger assembly out, which has a couple of more shell screws. Okay. Now get our trigger assembly out. And there are just an acre of locks in this thing. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, to get our slide out of here, we need to take off a screw on its return spring. Return spring is captive, so I'm going to leave it there. Alright, what do we have? On the rest of the shell, we have the other side of the release, and then we have whatever that is. Seems to be some kind of a lock or a release or something. Figured out what it does. I'll explain during reassembly. We got a bunch of more of these little silver screws, and then a washer-headed screw holding on this little spring-loaded thing. Not a captive spring. Be aware. That's it for the other side of the shell. Okay, let's take a look at the slide. There's a bunch of wheels on pins. I recommend leaving them alone. We do then have this jam release mechanism, which is causing a number of things to happen. That little gear tooth is rotating, and that bit underneath, I think I've figured out what exactly they're interacting with, so we'll take a look at that. I think we're going to have some small black screws, or are they the same? They are smaller. Okay. Yep, that removes that tab and this plate. A couple more small screws. And our little partial gear. That's everything off of there other than the return spring, which I'm going to leave on. Alright, finally we have our trigger group. It has a non-captive trigger return spring. Be aware of that. A couple of the screws that I took out weren't actually holding it to the blaster. I think it was just holding the housing together. There are going to be a whole bunch of fiddly little springs and stuff in here. There appear to be 3 different buttons on the top. This one is a trigger lock, so if this is not pushed, if this isn't pushed, the trigger is locked. If either of these 2 are pushed, they act as a trigger lock. So this unlocks the trigger, both of these lock the trigger. And then up front here, that is our release. So that's the catch, as it were. And we've got one weird looking screw right here. Take that out. Okay, now we should be able to take it off and hopefully not lose any of the... There's got to be at least 4 little springs in here. And our trigger and our shell. You would think a single shot rear prime blaster would be a lot simpler, but there is nothing simple about Vortex. We're going to start reassembly with our trigger group. So we have the housing for that. This would be the left side, as it were. And we are going to need to install all 3 of our locks and our catch. Now I'm going to start with the middle of the locks and then move my way forward and then finally come back and do the back one because it seems to be the most prone to springing and falling out. So the first lock is this one. And the little tab on the top of it is offset. It's more to one side than the other. It should be pointing, or it should be, the tab should be towards the shell, as it were. It really will only fit in one way, and it is a little tricky to get it in there with the spring. You just have to play with it and work it in, and shoot it at yourself. Be careful of springage, as always. You don't want to try to do this in a terribly cluttered place where it'd be easy for a spring to get lost. But you can see it'll only fit in one way. And it should be able to move up and down freely, just don't fiddle with it. Next we're going to put in this lock. The one with the peg on the top, and it has a rounded surface on one side. You can see that. that is the side that should be down, as it were. And once again, getting that spring in there correctly is a little bit tricky, but once it's in there, it should move up and down freely. Don't fiddle with it too much or you will spring it. We then have our catch, and it's got an angled surface on one side. That should be pointing down and back. It will just sit on the spring right there, and we'll move thusly. And now we're going to install that last one. And the easiest way that I have found is to put the spring in first, so it sits on the bottom little shelf there, and then is then kind of angled up and out. And then we're going to take this part, the catch itself, and it's got a cavity on one side, and that is going to be going down. You're going to hook the top of that cavity on your spring and pull it in and down. And that will get it into position and hopefully have the spring lying correctly. Now comes the tricky part. I am not going to lie. Getting the trigger in without having any of these sprung loose and then getting the other shell on is tricky. It may take you a couple of tries. It's taken me a couple of tries. I would recommend that unless you have a really good reason to take this trigger assembly apart, don't. There is no good reason to remove any of these locks. I know people like removing locks, but don't do it, or you're going to have to try to put this together and it's going to be a nightmare. These locks are in here for a very good reason. They keep the blaster from tearing itself apart. So we are going to put our trigger in over the top of our catch, carefully not to bump any of our locks. It does need to be as far forward as it will go. And then we are going to put the far side of the shell on, starting in the back and rocking it forward so that it will catch all of those locks and keep them from popping loose. We then need to get the catch to align into its hole. And if you do it right, everything will still be able to move as it's supposed to, lock as it is supposed to, and unlock as it is supposed to. We're going to put that one weird flat-headed screw. It's not like any other washer-headed screw I've ever seen in a Nerf blaster anyway. It's just a really flat screw, and we're going to get that in to keep this from falling apart. Alright. Alright, to go over the locks again, this is what this button unlocks it. So if this isn't pressed, the trigger is locked. So it's currently locked. We push it and it unlocks. However, these two then act as additional locks. So even if this one is pressed, if this one is pressed, it locks. Or if this one is pressed, it locks. If they're both pressed, it's locked. So this one has to be pressed and both of these have to not be pressed for it to be unlocked. And it will then release our catch right there, as you can see. So that is our trigger group. Let's move on to the next weird bit. All right, next we're going to reassemble the catapult system, the actual firing mechanism. We start with this piece of shell, and we're going to install this. The spring-loaded rubber bumper, which keeps the thing from shattering when you fire it. Very nice. Goes on that post. Push it down. Spring should be pointing towards the shell, fairly obviously. Next we put on our main spring. And again, there are two settings. There is the lower stock power setting, I assume, and then there appears to be a higher setting simply by rotating that further back and putting the screw in there. For ease of reassembly, I'm going to put it on the lower setting. Simply goes on there, and then we use one of our silver washer-headed screws. They all, as far as I can tell, appear to be the same, have the same head and thread, and keep that from wandering. We then have a cover plate that goes over the top of the spring to keep it in place, this part. And it'll only fit on there correctly, so we have a couple of the standard shell screws that are then holding it down. Now comes probably the trickiest part of this whole thing, installing our throwing arm, this part. It would be easy to install it like that, except it doesn't need to be in that position, it needs to be here. And yeah, getting it into that position is somewhat tricky. And what I'm going to try doing, and we'll see if it works, is I'm going to hook it on this way so it points there, and then try to force this up and around. And that did in fact work quite much easier than I thought. And then we're going to put up the long metal pin in through it and down into the shell. And so now we are in position, and it is all well and good. So we can put this aside now. The next complicated bit that we're going to assemble is going to be our slide. There were a couple of moving parts on it that we're going to reassemble, starting with this little half gear. It's going to go down in this little cavity on this post, and it should be in such a way that none of the teeth are sticking out. So there is a section that is missing teeth. That's what's pointing out. All the teeth should be pointed in. There is then a little cover plate. This. It's going to go down on top of it, like so. I think that'll only go in one way. And then we're going to use a pair of the smaller black screws. Next, we're going to put on this plate. Now, it has a captive spring and a couple of gear teeth that need to interact with those teeth. And again, like I said, the teeth need to not be sticking out when this plate is at rest. And that is the key. When this is at rest, that needs to have no teeth sticking out. So when you rotate it forward, then those teeth move. But when it's at rest, those teeth need to not be interacting with anything so that it can slide smoothly by without those teeth catching. So we then have our button on the far side, and we have another couple of our little black screws, I hope. That now operates the de-jamming system. And we'll see how those two things, both the gears on the side and that plate on the bottom, are interacting with various parts inside the blaster when we get to them. So, let's get to them. We're now going to take a look at the shell, the left side of the shell. It had a couple of parts on it that we need to reinstall. First is this part. And it has a spring that went on right there, I believe, and then we are going to put this down on top of it so that it goes over this screw post here at the base, and then we're going to use one of our washer-headed screws to hold that down. We then have this plate, which goes in over the top of it and holds it in place. And I believe it is held in by a pair of these tiny little silver screws. At least I sure hope it is. That should now be able to move up and down. Okay, we're now going to take a look at the other side of the shell. The right side of the shell, and it has a number of parts that go in, starting with this part, which has an angled surface on one side and some little gear teeth on the other. It does have a spring, and that spring is going to be hooked on a small tab that's sticking up right there. And you can, I was able to just push it in on top. Just make sure that it's not getting pinched or anything and that it can slide freely. We then have this part, That spring-loaded bit with a wheel, that's going to go here on top of that surface, so that when this gets pulled back, that is now free to lower. And we'll see what that's about in a minute. This is held in place by the last of our two little silver screws. And then over here we have a plate that sits over the top of it. You might have to pull that thing back a little bit to get it underneath the plate, but it will sit on top like so, and is then held in place by our last two smaller black screws. So we've got that little section there. Alright, now that we have all the major parts assembled, we can start to look at how all of these mechanisms actually work. So we have this moving part here, we've got these two levers here, we have this spring-loaded bit here. What exactly do they all do? Well, to explain what these parts do, we need to install the rail section. It had that one little spring-loaded bit right there, and it turns out that is part of all of this. So we're going to put it on the left side of the blaster. When we took the blaster apart, it came out on the right side, but we actually need it on the left side because that is where the actuator arm for that spring-loaded bit resides. So when this gets pulled down, you can see it raises that little wheel. Similarly, if you push on that wheel, it forces down that actuator arm. I don't know how well that's showing up there. Pushing on the wheel makes it go down. Pulling down on this makes the wheel go up. They are, in fact, linked in both directions. And that is important because it actually serves two different purposes. On the far side, we had that geared, that angled surface part with the gears on it that made that wheel recess because the wheel was spring-loaded. That interacts with part of our slide. So remember, we had that partial gear that when you push on this, the teeth come out. You can see there. When the slide is in the blaster and is all the way forward, when we push on that button, those gears cause that wheel to move back. And what that wheel does is that is what is holding, one of the things that is holding the disc in place. That's what keeps it from just falling out of the barrel. When you push it in, the disc can now simply slide loose. And that is how that whole disc release button works. It also, since that whole thing is moving there, that interacts with the wheel on the other side of the blaster. So when we're in here on this side and we push that button, and this is what's going to be tricky for me to be able to show you, that little wheel in there also moves. It forces that tab down, which forces that wheel up. So when we have a disc in the blaster, that wheel on the top is also holding it in, and when you push it in, it will release the disc. But in addition, simply having a disc in there partially forces that wheel down. So when we have a disc in the blaster and it slides forward, that wheel does get pushed up, which then pushes this down, which is important because there is a tab on this arm that is in fact a trigger lock, a second trigger lock that prevents you from firing the blaster if there isn't a disc in there. So they've got redundant trigger locks built in to ensure that the blaster is loaded before you fire it, and is loaded with proper ammunition, that you can't just shove anything in there and release that lock. It does kind of need to be fairly specifically shaped like this. So that's one of the trigger locks, is that part getting pushed down out of alignment with the trigger. But there is 3 more in our trigger group. So we are going to install first this, which in order to get it in, you have to pull this slide down so that it will let you get the slide in. Slide then goes into place, and we can put it in and then use one of our washer-headed screws to hold the slide return spring in place. That will then have the slide return like it's supposed to. And now we're going to take a look at the trigger group, because there is a whole lot going on, and all of these things, most of these things, seem to serve more than one purpose. Getting it in there is a little bit finicky. This whole release, this tab needs to go into a groove, a slot there in the slide. So you're going to put it in so that that interacts with that. And then of course there's a couple of screw posts that everything needs to properly sit down on. And there it is. And we can put our return spring in. Careful, it's not captive and is prone to springing. Alright, we're going to zoom in and I'm going to try to explain what all of those locks do as best I can. We have established that that little button in there has to be pushed down or you can't pull the trigger. That is part of the trigger lock. We've also established that that little roller, that wheel, has to be pushed up or the trigger will be locked. So something has to be pushing one down and the other up, and obviously that is the disc. Now, as we start to open the breech, that little button gets pushed down. You can see that. As it goes back, that button gets pushed down, and that is obviously to allow the disc to slide over the top of it as you load. The pin comes back up there, as you can see, which locks the trigger. And then once you put a disc in, as it comes forward, that button goes down, but it can't come back up because now the disc is in the way. And also that wheel from the top is now putting pressure on the disc, which one holds the disc in place, but also unlocks our trigger. So now we are in fact able to pull the trigger. Now, things that will lock the trigger. If we actually operate the slide release on the side, that locks the trigger. You can see that that tab right there comes down and blocks the trigger, and that is the result of us pulling down on the far side to the slide release will in fact lock the trigger. So even though we have a disc in and we should be able to pull the trigger, if we pull the slide lock, it will lock the trigger. Now, a whole bunch of other things happen while this slide is operating. You remember that I mentioned that if that button is pressed, it will unlock the trigger, and yet that button is down and the wheel has been forced up by the slide operating. So the wheel is up and the button is down, and yet our trigger is locked. And it is locked because of that middle lock. Remember, we had the one in the back that is linked to our slide release. We have the one in the front that is pushed down by the disc, and then there was one in the middle. And the middle one is the intermediate lock that locks it while the slide is moving. So the button is down, the wheel is up, but it's still locked because of that middle lock. When we get all the way back, it turns out that this rear trigger lock is also the slide lock. It's what holds the slide open while we're loading, which is why it is linked to that release lever. So releasing it releases the slide. As it starts to come forward, it's no longer locking the trigger. The middle lock is now locking the trigger. When we get all the way forward, the middle lock releases, but now that button is back up, and so we are still locked. So yeah, there are a lot of locks in here, but you really don't want to remove any of them because you do not want to dry fire this blaster. So that's how all your locks are working. If something isn't unlocking, take a look and make sure that those things are all able to move. Yes, it is complicated. There are 4 different locks in this thing for a single shot rear load blaster. All right, let's install the firing mechanism, and we'll see why it is important not to remove those locks. All right, finally, we do have a couple of screws that need to go in to hold this together. There are actually 2 black shell screws that hold the trigger assembly together that I forgot to mention when we assembled it. I did mention the silver one there, but then there's 2 that go right there. We then have, it looks like, 2 more regular ones and then 1 long one. And I'm hoping I'm getting them in the right order. If not, I'll mention it. We've got 1 here, 1 up here, and then I assume the long one went up here. We've got 1 long silver screw, and this seems to be the most likely place. Alright, finally we are going to install our catapult. It kind of goes in, it feels like it's going in upside down, but the throwing arm should be pointing forward, of course. The throwing arm is going to need to go into the slot on the bottom of our slide, and then you will need to align both the metal pin that it hinges on and a couple of screw posts. You can see where the spring-loaded bumper is up against the shell there, and then we have just a couple of our regular shell screws holding it all down. Now, why do I highly discourage removing any of the locks from this blaster? It is because of the nature of that firing mechanism. It is, in fact, a catapult arm that slams forward, hooking the disc and flinging it out of the blaster. And removing the locks would allow you to dry fire this, and you absolutely do not want to dry fire one of these. That arm flinging forward has a lot of force, and it would probably break the internals if it were able to fire while not throwing a disc. That is why there is not only 1 lock, not 2, not 3, there are at least 4 different locks in this to make sure that you absolutely cannot pull the trigger if the blaster is not loaded and the breech is not closed. Because the breech getting slammed forward would be bad. There were just a lot of, there was nothing good that would happen from dry firing this. And so they have made sure that there are redundant locks that make it absolutely impossible to pull the trigger if it is not loaded and in battery. Because you could have a disc that was in there but still have the slide open, and that would mean the slide would get slammed shut. It would not be good. Things would end up getting broken. And so they have gone to a lot of trouble to ensure that you cannot do that. So I recommend leaving all the locks in there. They do not hamper function. I mean, hypothetically, if you removed the middle lock, I think you would then be able to deprime the blaster if you had a disc in it. Like I said, don't do it. Just don't do it. Okay, the last thing that needs to go on this side of the shell is going to be this part, which both fills a gap here in the front and also acts as one of the screw posts for the muzzle. We can get rid of that. And then we do have one last bit to install on this side of the shell, which was this plate, which is just part of the shell that the, as far as I can tell, the slide operates on. It goes right there, and then we have our last 2 washer-headed screws. Right, with that in place, we should now be able to assemble the 2 halves of the shell. And that actually went together fairly smooth. And then our muzzle goes on the end, right way up. Let's try to get that there we go. Excellent. And now we can start putting in screws. All of the shell screws are identical, so it does not matter which way they go in. Okay, we have it fully reassembled. Let's check all of the controls and make sure it still works. It's not loaded or primed, so the trigger is locked. If we pull it back and prime it and then close it, it remains locked even though it's primed. If we pull it back and load it, now it will fire. If we pull it back and load it and then push on this tab, the round will simply fall out of the barrel, but it remains locked. Reload and fire. So there is the full disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Vortex Proton. Survey for which ones I cover next will be down in the descriptions. I do plan to do at least one more Proton Blaster, probably 2, and then I will branch out into the ones that you guys are requesting. But again, survey will be down in the description. I hope this was helpful to some of you, and thank you guys for watching.